the inevitability of the abolition of religion, etc., all of that is now crumbling. But I also think there's a theological thing going on here. I think there is a great quest for meaning.
And I wonder what you think the impact could be of a potential revival of Christianity amongst younger people on the culture of the country more broadly, and what the consequences might actually be for English culture if there isn't a revival. I'm Emma Trimble, this is GBN Originals. So this week we have seen a surprisingly good news story that amongst Gen Z, there has been a rise in church-going, particularly amongst Catholic and Pentecostal Christians. So I'm delighted to say that we are joined by Fergus Butler Gailey, who is the Vicar of St Mary's, Charlbury, and was also the author of several books, including Touching Cloth, Confessions and Communions of a Young Priest. Thank you so much for joining us, Fergus. So let's dig into some of these statistics. The most interesting one that stood out to me is that there is this sort of trough in the middle amongst the godless generation of millennials and boomers, and it's actually sort of those who are over the age of 65, who are at 19%, identifying as Christian and church-going. And now, second to that, those who are between the ages of 18 and 24, who are polling at around 16%. What explains this resurgence of Christianity amongst the youth?
I think there's a couple of things. I think one, the perhaps most preeminent, the world that the baby boomers and Gen X, and to a certain extent millennials, have built which was a world, lest we forget, where we were told that religion would inevitably fade away. It was a kind of world of inevitable progress. Think of the end of history, that kind of stuff. And that has proven, I think, in the last decade or so, to be manifestly a lie. All of the presumptions that kind of world, with its progressive worldview, the inevitability of the abolition of religion, etc., all of that is now crumbling. We're seeing that it's completely incorrect. All of the things that religion has sought historically to help us to deal with on a purely social factor, we'll get into theology later, but in a purely social factor, there's the fact that all of those things like war and disease, economic uncertainty, all of those things are back on the agenda. And it's therefore not surprising that people are turning to these sort of social things that in the past, previous generations have turned to, and preeminent among those is religion. But I also think there's a theological thing going on here. I think there is a great quest for meaning. The generation we're seeing growing up, Gen Z and the generation after, are people who have been often brought up without any of these anchors. It's not even that their grandparents were anchored in this, right? If their parents are geriatric millennials or members of Gen X, and their grandparents are baby boomers, it is possible that they have no living relations who are churchgoers or have any kind of meaningful relationship with God. Therefore, they are discovering these ancient theological truths afresh, and they are excited by them, as people have always been, because there isn't a sort of sociological expectation which sort of the baby boomers famously kick back against. So I think you are not only is there an obvious sociological explanation in terms of the state of the world we live in, I think there is also a related issue whereby actually people are discovering these words, these doctrines, these practices, these rituals afresh and anew, and are finding them compelling.
Do you think we live in a society where there has, at least for a very long time until very recently, been a sort of aversion to talking about ideas and philosophy or theology as something that actually motivates people? Do you think that maybe amongst these younger people that there is a sort of allergic reaction, maybe in one sense to as we've seen with Christianity, the same as with English, British identity more broadly, this constant denigration of Christianity, that maybe there's a sort of philosophical reaction in this also, not just against that sort of constant negativity, but also against what they see as being radical untruths in things like critical theory, and that actually critical theory being quite sort of theological itself, being a sort of religious worldview, that maybe that's introduced younger people into a less rationalistic way of thinking, and maybe a more religious way of thinking. And in reacting to those radical untruths, it's made it sort of stand out more in relief, the truth that they find in Christianity.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth mentioning that through kind of these constant phases of deconstruction, modernism, postmodernism, as you say, critical theory, actually everything has now become contested. And so things that previous generations and things that people who were fundamentally peddling those untruths actually took for granted, the rights of individuals, the value of love and beauty and truth, etc. Those things that in their private and personal lives they inevitably did take for granted, even if they claimed in their professional or academic lives not to. Those things, because of what has been peddled, are now being deconstructed on a quite serious level and are contested at a quite serious level. And so I think it's inevitable that those generations are saying, well, okay, our parents had this, this bounty and this beauty and this truth. Our parents had these ideas about, marriage, or about the stability of the family, about the fundamental decency of community, of life together. All of these things we've now been deconstructed in front of us. We have to learn where those assumptions actually came from, because very clearly it did not come from these people, the goodness of these people as individuals, frankly. It didn't come through human nature. And I think we're seeing, you're right, because actually we're realizing that this kind of humanist, rationalist view is, if anything, considerably more superstitious and considerably less rational than what religion teaches, because it requires you to believe that human nature simply pops good out of nowhere. Deus ex machina, people are good, and therefore they will behave in a good way. Now we are seeing very clearly, again and again, you only have to watch the news headlines, we're realizing that's not true, and that those things that the people who peddled that took for granted are being deconstructed, are being contested. And so I think it's inevitable, absolutely, that younger generations are saying, okay, well, where does this stuff really come from? Where does it really come from? What are the real origins? And they are being pointed again and again, inevitably, to Christianity.
So to return to some of these stats in this survey that was commissioned by the Bible Society through YouGov, it also found that this rise in Christianity amongst the youth seems to be driven primarily by young men. So 21% of these young men said that they attended church regularly, compared to just 12% of women. What do you think explains that?
That's really interesting, isn't it? I think on one level, it mirrors something we're seeing politically. I think we're seeing a divergence of the political opinions of young men and young women. I believe there's polling done on that broadly speaking, young men are identifying more with traditional patterns of political thinking, nation and family, etc., whereas young women are perhaps more likely to be clinging on to some of those more liberal assumptions that previous generations generally propagated. So I suspect there's something going on there that mirrors the political and general social trend. But I also think there's perhaps something that in some sense men are catching up. Actually, I look at the congregations generally, and they are, on the whole, biased towards female membership in older generations. Actually, in congregations I've served in, there tends to actually be a fairly healthy smattering of women from millennial, Gen X, and Boomer generations. What there aren't is men. So in some sense, I wonder whether younger men are making up for that it's an even more kind of radical act of rebellion, simply because there are fewer men of the ages of, say, 25 to 65 in those congregations. They are, the people who are least likely to attend religious worship in the United Kingdom are men between the ages of 25 and 40. That is the absolute demographic that is least well represented currently. Christian worship, I should say. Obviously, there are different religions where that is not the case. Indeed, it radically is biased towards that demographic. But within Christianity and within certainly the mainstream churches, I think that's the case. So I wonder whether there's almost a kind of, not only is it men of a younger generation who are looking for a degree of certainty, they're looking for a degree of purpose that has been kind of denied them, I think, by a kind of constant sort of barrage of negative publicity, negative messaging towards them. So I think inevitably being taken to a place where someone says, no, you are valued, you are loved, you matter, that of course is going to be quite a radical thing for them. But I think also perhaps it becomes even more radical when you consider the decline in religiosity of men in the previous generations as well. It creates more of a contrast.
And what about this disparity between, so the study found that this growth is primarily amongst Catholics and Pentecostals, but actually that this general trend of decline in the Anglican Church is still continuing even amongst Gen Z. So is there something in there that is a message that could be taken away by the Church of England, maybe about how they could be growing their numbers if they were to make certain changes?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. I would caveat it with particularly Pentecostals and a number of Roman Catholic churches. Mass migration has inevitably led to an awful lot of those numbers. So whilst we are seeing growth, I'm not going to dispute the growth among young men. When we consider that the population growth in this country among that band of people is largely coming from people from elsewhere, and that inevitably favours Roman Catholicism and Pentecostal churches because they are particularly strong in places where a lot of that migration is coming from, notably Africa. But I don't want to just, I think some Anglicans are in danger of explaining it away by saying, oh, it's purely, migration figures diddling the numbers. That's clearly not the case. Something is going on. I think what both of those churches in very different ways offer is clarity. They're offering something that is mystical, explicitly saying we are offering something that is above and beyond what the kind of are very kind of mercenary, very 2D, very kind of superficial culture is going to offer you. We are offering something that is transcendental. We're offering something that is mysterious, something that is strange, and something that crucially matters. And I think there are pockets of serious growth in the Church of England. I can name you a number of churches that have seen, growth that spikes through the top. Those are invariably churches that are offering something similar to those. I think the problem is you have a kind of soggy middle within the Church of England that is not prepared, partly because it is run by baby boomers, it's run by managerialists, it's run by people who think what we need to give people is something that is like what the world is giving them, whereas what we actually need to give them is something that is mysterious and beautiful and true and transcends what the world is giving them. I think that's the lesson for the Church of England. It is being done within the Church of England. It is happening. There are pockets of that, and where it is happening, you are seeing indisputable, exponential growth of attendance among younger people. But I think there is still this mindset that is kind of absolutely fatal. It's just atrophying, and it's a mindset that exists within a number of our institutions. I don't think the Church of England is unique in this regard. I would say there are clearly pockets of the Roman Catholic Church where this is the case as well. And actually, in traditional nonconformity, outside Pentecostalism, the United Reformed Church, the Methodist Church, mainstream Baptist churches, you're seeing exactly the same type of thought process. And we see it within the National Health Service, the education system, the mainstream media channels. We see it in higher education. We see it in the civil service. We see it everywhere. And it's that kind of managerial culture that seeks to, rather than actually engage with people where they are, to kind of manage them out of decline and to create more and more layers and to tell them, oh, what you need is something new and different, as opposed to why don't we look at what we do well and try and do that with integrity and authenticity, and actually maybe people will come. That's the mindset the Church of England, I think, needs to shake itself out of, and pronto. And in that case, I think where you do see churches doing that, ministering with integrity, ministering with authenticity, ministering with a sense of what is beautiful and transcendental and true, you are seeing growth.
Yeah, I often have a lot. People will message me and they'll say, if I've said you go to church, they say, well, my local church is one of these soggy churches and it doesn't offer me the seriousness that I'm looking for. Do you think that the Church of England's leadership should quite seriously consider returning to more traditional forms of worship rather than this soggy, woolly almost shy version of Anglicanism that has been very uncomfortable with asserting any kind of truth whatsoever and seems to lack confidence in preaching the gospel. And that's something that doesn't seem authentic. It's not something that is very attractive to younger people.
Using the internet without a VPN, a virtual private network, is a bit like taking to the road without car insurance. All it takes is one unlucky moment to cost you a lot of cash. This video's sponsor is Private Internet Access. They are the VPN to help keep you safe. Click the link in the description below to find out why over 30 million people have downloaded PIA to protect themselves online. A virtual private network is an app that hides your IP address and helps keep your data private. When you're browsing the internet at home, you give up a large amount of data to businesses, to shops, and indeed to social media giants too. Hackers have the ability to steal your personal data with ease, including sensitive information such as passwords, keystrokes, and even your personal photos. Private Internet Access helps protect your personal data by encrypting your internet connection to keep your data out of the hands of cyber criminals. And it's not just hackers either to be concerned about. Information can be censored too. When Canada passed their C18 bill, social media giants decided to ban news content on their platforms. But PIA can protect your ability to consume the news and content you love. Private Internet Access is available for Windows users, Mac OS, Android, Linux, iOS, and you can use one PIA subscription to protect an unlimited amount of devices. And we've got a huge GB News discount for you too. Click the link in this video's description and you'll get a massive 83% off PIA. That's under £2 a month, the price of a coffee, and you'll get an extra 4 months completely free on top. Also, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee too. Visit piavpn.com/GB News to start protecting yourself digitally today.
Absolutely. I mean, let me tell you something. I hate waking up early. I hate getting up early. I am a proper night owl. I loathe getting out of bed. I have to have a pretty good reason to get out of bed in the morning, right? And particularly on a Sunday, right? The idea that we are going to get people giving up what is increasingly precious free time, right? Let's be clear about that. People's time is bombarded constantly. This is a very basic level. The idea that we're going to get people out of bed for something that they could just, frankly, read in a Guardian editorial, or that they could get from from a park run or a community cafe, is nonsense. People are not going to do it. They're simply not going to do it. What will get them out of bed is something that they believe to be true. That is the fundamental line. And so they believe something that is going to speak to them on a much deeper level than simply saying, oh, this is going to, this is like having a coffee in a cafe, but it happens to be in a Gothic building. It's got to be more than that. It's got to be more than that. On the very basic level, before we even get to whether people are believing it or not, to even get them out of bed, there's got to be something transcendental there, I think. So absolutely. And I think if you look at where growth is happening, it is happening where this stuff is done in a compelling way. And I think certainly anecdotally, and I'd be fascinated to see some of the stats on this. I know historically you've seen enormous growth at things like cathedral evensongs, etc. And I think anecdotally I can say that it is in the more kind of traditional patterns of worship and the restoration of traditional patterns of worship that I've seen younger people attending. I think there needs to be a serious look at this. And there's still this idea that what you do to get people in is you do something that doesn't look like church. Well, actually, what people are crying out for is stuff that looks and sounds like church. And therefore, I think we are at risk of, to paraphrase the words of Christ himself, people are asking for bread and we're giving them a stone. We're giving them something empty. We're giving them something platitudinous, and we're patronizing them. And again, what younger generations are constantly searching for is authenticity. They are searching for an authentic identity. They have acknowledged that the attempts by previous generations, particularly the baby boomers onwards, to kind of fashion this deeply individualistic sense of identity have failed. Therefore, they are looking for something that can say, okay, right, you are part of this thing that is bigger, that transcends time and transcends space. And I think if we're going to come along and patronize them and, talk to them like they're children, there's this terrible trend that the way in Church of England churches that people seem to think that the way you get more children to attend is by treating adults as if they're six. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. You've got to have something. Of course, you make provision for families. We have a in my church, we have a very active family ministry. It's great. It's wonderful. I'm not saying that you don't provide kids clubs and you don't go into schools and you don't engage with young people. But actually, if we're going to look at people in their teens, their 20s, and in their 30s, people for whom this world is strange and confusing and difficult, you've got to provide something that's got coherent answers for that. And if it's just wishy-washy, faintly patronizing nonsense about being nice to people, it is not going to wash in this day and age.
Yeah, no, I visit a lot of cathedrals and I'm always shocked by just how infantilizing the way that some of the things are presented in these places. And people seem to be so hungry for sanctity and sacred space. And then you see these people who have custodianship of these wonderful sacred spaces. And then like Malmesbury Abbey, they turn it into a glorified Costa coffee. I was wondering what you think about the demographics of Christianity versus, say, Islam, because the average age of a Christian in this country, according to the last census, is 51, whereas the average age for Muslims is 27. So there's quite a big disparity there in terms of the future of those religions in Britain. And I wonder what you think the impact could be of a potential revival of Christianity amongst younger people on the culture of the country more broadly, and what the consequences might actually be for English culture if there isn't a revival.
I mean, so yes, I think I would expect to see a lowering of that age demographic if these numbers are borne out. That there's a simple fact there in terms of the idea that if there are younger people coming, then that age demographic should, we should see it shrinking, or rather we should see it lowering over the next few years. I'd be really interested to trace that, if we see it lowering into the 40s and 30s, particularly as the older generation die off. And as we said, the generations in between are not as reliable in their church going. So I would hope to see, first and foremost, that number on the average age of a Christian in the UK, in England, dropping first and foremost. I suppose there are multiple issues going on, of course. One of the reasons why, so for example, the church has teachings on marriage and on family life that presumably young Christians are seeking to uphold. But of course, it's made exceptionally difficult for young people to settle down, to buy a house, to start a family. So I think this is an exceptionally interlinked and complicated question when it comes to how faith influences demographics. Now, what I would hope is that a renewed Christian faith will give younger people the confidence, say, well, actually, we're not going to simply wait for, the tax credit system to catch up. We're not going to wait for, Rachel Reeves to magically stimulate the economy. We're not going to wait for, the last boomers to finally give up their triple-plated pensions in order to enable the buying of houses. We're going to have to just take a leap, quite literally, a leap of faith, and start a family and start, marrying. So it'll be really interesting to see whether, kind of interrelated demographic question is whether you see the age of mothers lowering, whether you see the age of marriage lowering, because that has been creeping up and up and up as society has secularized. But it's not only the loss of religion that's been to blame for that. I think it's also inevitably a result of economic circumstances and of the wider sociological malaise I think we find ourselves in. So I think the turn back to religion is partly a reaction to that. Whether there can be a sort of flip in terms of whether religion has a part to play in kind of reversing that trend of sort of demographic and sociological decline, or the creeping up of age, the lowering of the birth rate, etc. I don't know. I would certainly hope so. And I think, again, if the church wants to speak confidently into this situation, it needs to. I've written on this about the church's role with housing, etc. I think the church can give a serious message of hope to young people who are not being given that message of hope by the government, by other institutions, and by, frankly, the economic system. They're not being given that message of hope by any of those things because they seem to be stuck in this kind of doom loop of jobs that don't earn enough, that enable them to settle down and to lead the lives that they want to lead. And so they're stuck in this existential emptiness. So I would seriously hope that actually, if the church was serious, it would set up some kind of task force, set up a really deliberate campaign to say, actually, there is a life here. that goes simply beyond just the attendance of church, but actually the idea that you are taking your faith out into your community and you are transforming it accordingly. And that involves, marriage and family life. That involves serving your community. It involves taking seriously the obligations that a Christian has to his neighbor. So I would hope that it does see a kind of reversal of that. And with regard to the question of the demographic future of Islam, as you say, Islam in Britain very, very demographically considerably younger. Again, that's partly the result of birth rates and things. So I suspect there might be an equaling out of that. There is a question of economic and migration policy, because there's a kind of constant top up that happens that is outside the birth rate for Islam that doesn't tend to happen in Christianity. Although, as we said, part of the Catholic and the Pentecostal rises are a result of that topping up. Now, if respective parties are firmer on migration policy, which they all claim they're going to be, now let's see whether any of that actually comes to fruition. But then you could see a kind of capping off of exponential growth of religious migrants of any type, really, but specifically the largest subset is obviously Islamic. So whether that then affects the demographics, I think remains to be seen. But I would certainly hope that if young people are there and they're taking their Christianity seriously, it might give them the faith and give them the confidence to take those leaps that really need to be made to reverse, what is essentially a real problem in terms of birth and marriage rates in the country.
Yeah, anecdotally, I think that actually the demands that traditional Christianity makes on a person in terms of marriage and so on, actually, I think that seems to be what does appeal to young people, that there is some commitment there, that there are some boundaries, some limitations in a world where they're mostly online in this limitless space that completely lacks that kind of commitment. And they've been constantly told by society that commitment is a hindrance to their freedom, and they find something very meaningful in that. I wanted to also ask you about the impact of the decline of Anglicanism on church buildings, because obviously it's one thing that seems to upset a lot of people is you see churches being turned into mosques, Lidl's, Tesco's, apartment complexes, all sorts of things. And that's outside of the fact that, churches are being used to host raves and all sorts of other secular activities. And you alluded to the importance of beauty in people's experience of meaning and truth. And I wondered if you think it matters if, these church buildings, as Anglicanism declines, are lost to other purposes, whether that's something that actually, should not just concern the church, but, every English person whose inheritance those buildings are part of.
Yeah, what I would say is the Church of England actually has pretty rigorous rules on what it allows deconsecrated buildings to be used as. Those buildings that you see turned into kind of retail and specifically into other worship will, I can assure your viewers, be non-conformist buildings. It is actually illegal for a Church of England church to be turned into a mosque. And there's been actually a recent case where a decommissioned Church of England church, I think in Blackburn, has been demolished rather than be allowed to be used for other worship. So the Church of England actually has quite strong statutory rules on this. However, you're right. There is a fundamental issue that we're seeing in a kind of canary in the coal mine situation with the Church of Scotland, Presbyterian Church, the state church, national church north of the border, which has just gone through a massive divestment of its property and selling things like, the Great Kirk in Aberdeen is being flogged, Inverness, the old kirk there, places where there have been thousands of years of Christian worship. And that is a serious problem, I think. What I would say to anyone who's concerned about that, now, the Church of England isn't there yet, I would say, actually. There was a period where churches were closed and they were, broadly speaking, demolished, occasionally turned into housing, but broadly speaking, demolished. And as I say, policy has got a bit stricter on that, what can be done with them. And indeed, dioceses, and there are many, many reasons to criticise the Church of England, but actually, all credit to them, dioceses are increasingly seeking not to close churches, partly because they know it doesn't work. They actually have begun to realize it does not work. If you shut a church, the idea was in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, you would shut a church and people say, oh, well, they'll go elsewhere. That doesn't happen. If you shut a church, it's a symbol of decline. So increasingly, there are things like the Churches Conservation Trust that will seek to keep, churches in, let's take an example, rural Norfolk, where actually you're dealing with depopulation that goes back to the Black Death in some places. And the maintenance of a church is very difficult for a community of 10, 15, 20, 50 people. But they might still want it for Christmas or for Easter. So you do have these mechanisms now where we can keep the game. But what I would say to anyone who is worried about this and is worried about the future, the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, because I think that's where we are looking at a crunch point for some church buildings. What I would say to people is go to your local church. That is the best way that you make it happen. You can sit and you can complain all you like. Unless you are going to your local church, unless you are turning up and being part of that community, frankly, you can moan all you like. It's not going to change anything. And it will become something else. It will be locked down. It will become a Costa. It will become a mosque, whatever. So whatever church you're going to, or whatever church you are worried about, go to it. Be part of the local community. Be part of what you find there. Because I promise you, they will be very pleased to see you. And you know what? Sometimes that will involve you sitting through stuff that is annoying, stuff that you're frustrated with. But again, if you want to change the nature of the Church of England and its sogginess, the way you do that is you engage and you are part of that congregation and you make them realize that, in fact, actually, this is not what people are crying out for. People are crying out for something deeper. So I think the buildings question and the kind of the question of attendance are the same question. If you care about these kind of repositories that we have of memory and of beauty and of truth, if you care about the presence of something in every single community that speaks of something deeper than just the commercial, if you care about there being a space that is open to all by statute, again, because the Church of England, the Roman Catholic Church or the non-conformist churches can turn people away on the basis of membership. The Church of England will not and cannot do that. If you go and you live in the parish, you have certain legal rights there. That is the nature of an established church. It's the great irritation and the great beauty of the Church of England. But if you care about that still being there, go along. That's the only solution.
You have lined me up so perfectly for my final question, because my dad says that churches are like pubs, you use them or lose them. So my final question to you is a question that I also recently put to Father Jamie Franklin. Many people who are watching this video, viewers of GB News, will not be Christian, religious, Anglican. Maybe they might be concerned, but perhaps they, don't have the inclination to, as you say, sit through those annoying aspects of some church services. So, what would your message be to those viewers who maybe are not completely aligned theologically, religiously? What would your message to them be?
Well, I would say to them, do you believe in abstract truths? By which I ask, do you believe in beauty? Do you believe in truth? If the answer to those is yes, and I think for 99% of people they do, and again, if they're concerned, presumably they are concerned because they believe that things that are untrue will be propagated in the place of what the church is doing, or they believe that certain things that they believe to be beautiful will no longer be there. So if they are prepared to assent to the concepts of beauty and of truth, I would say that they are some way along the process of engaging with God. And I would say that again, the nature of the Church of England is such that not everybody who is sitting in the pew next to you will believe exactly the same thing about God. And that is, there is a degree of beauty in that latitude. There is a reason why in the Book of Common Prayer, the creed begins, I believe. So the individual is allowed the latitude that they need to be there and to be part of it. I believe in God. Now, what you understand by that and what I understand by that will necessarily be different, because we come with different baggage and we come with different human experience. And we come with different conceptions of what is beautiful and what is true. But if we can agree that there is that which is beautiful and that which is true, then, and if we agree fundamentally, and this is the next leap I would ask them to make, that actually that isn't always found in human capacity, that humanity is in fact capable of great evil and great wrong, and that actually if something is truly beautiful and truly true, it necessarily doesn't actually originate exclusively with humanity. Then you can begin to talk about what is transcendent. So I would say to them, if you want to reject any idea of anything beyond the immediate existence, if you want to live an purely empirical life, and deny that beauty or truth is anything more than a chemical reaction in your brain, then okay, maybe you need to sit this one out. But I would say that the vast majority of people are actually prepared from their own experience to acknowledge that the beautiful and the true exist on a plane that is above and beyond the purely human. And I would say, if you're prepared to commit to that, then go along to your church, even go along when it's empty, and start communicating with those ideas of beauty and truth. Don't necessarily go along on a Sunday. Go light a candle. Go be quiet for 5 minutes. There are very few places where you're allowed to do that. Very few places where you're allowed to do that. No one's going to ask you to buy anything. No one's going to badger you to do anything. Go find space, find what is beautiful and find what is true. And I would say that I hope would begin a process of engagement. I would say to them that each and every one of us is on a journey of religious faith. I do not claim to be there already. I do not claim to be a perfect Christian. I am in many ways a terrible Christian. I fail and I fall and I falter. But the whole point of Christianity is it calls you back again and again and again. And that is what I would say to them. Whatever stage of unbelief you're at, whatever stage of fallenness you're at, whatever stage of doubt you are at, it is still worth simply going and engaging with a space where the beautiful and the true have been hallowed for thousands of years.
Beautifully, beautifully put. And as St. Paul said, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God.
Indeed,
Reverend Fergus Butler
right.
Gailey, thank you so much for joining us here on GB News Originals. Don't forget to like and subscribe so that you can keep up to date with all of GBN Originals content.